And I'm still admitting people, but I think we're going to get started for the sake of time. I know Monika's got a lot of stuff she's going to share with us tonight. This is more of a storytelling type webinar, and we are looking at somebody who has spent a lot of time with the Southern residents and has a lot of really great stories to tell. So we're excited you're here tonight. And I'm going to introduce Monika. She's the co-founder and director of the nonprofit Orca Behavior Institute, which conducts non-invasive behavioral and acoustic research on all the orcas of the Salish Sea. She's been studying, photographing, and sharing stories about the whales since 2000, and is the author of the book Endangered Orcas, the story of the Southern residents, which shares a lot of insight and many personal tales of her time and the observations that she's had with the Southern residents. And not just that, in fact, I've got it here. I've pretty much dog-eared the appendix in the back that's got some really great information that I have not been able to find anywhere else. So when I'm putting together a lot of educational material for Orca Network, I often refer to your book, Monika, which is awesome. So I'm really excited that you're here to talk with all of us tonight. I'm going to turn it over to you. If anybody's having any technical difficulties, just reach me in the chat and we'll work through it.
All right, thanks you guys so much for being here on this beautiful June evening. The official kickoff for Orca Month is coming up this weekend, and I hope you guys will check that out too on Sunday, but we have a little bit of a pre-kickoff event here, so I'm glad you all heard about this and were able to join us tonight. This is kind of a new talk for me. Amanda asked if I would put something together on, on the families of the Southern residents, because that's sort of the theme of Orca Month this year is we are family. And that of course is so central to who they are and to who we are. So rather than it being kind of a scientific presentation, it is more of a storytelling presentation. Which in some ways was a little bit more challenging for me to figure out kind of what to talk about and what to put together. But on the other hand, I think the idea of family among the Southern residents really gets at a piece of who they are that maybe the science hasn't quite caught up to yet or hasn't fully captured yet. That the reason that we're drawn to these whales is in part because of their complex social structure and these long-term family bonds that they have with one another. So it's such a rich topic, and we'll just be scratching the surface tonight, but I hope there will be time for some of your questions at the end as well. So if you read the description for this talk, I kind of started with the concept of, when I was a biology student and when we're learning about biology and specific species and their interactions with their environment, we learn about the needs, the things that they need to survive, right? They need food, they need habitat, and they need shelter. And for a lot of species, they'll have nests or dens or burrows that are kind of their home base. And then they'll have, a territory that they range from there, but they have shelter, they have a home in a very physical sense. And orcas don't really have that. And Astrid van Ginneken of the Center for Whale Research wrote a novel that she published in 2007 called Togetherness is Our Home. And that phrase, ever since I first saw the title of that book, that phrase has really stayed with me and really embodies, I think, the essence of killer whales, and part of what draws us to them is togetherness is their home. Their homes are their families, and they range over these huge distances, and they don't have that physical, home base. Their home base is each other, and that's very different than what we find in a lot of other species. And a common question that I get when people are learning about orcas or interviewing me about orcas is, what can we learn from them? And as I was putting this talk together, that sense of connectedness and the importance of that connectedness really came to my mind as something that we can learn from them about the importance of that and the strength that comes from that. So in the book Spirits of the Coast, Jess Housey wrote an essay called Kinship. And if you don't have the book, or if you haven't read it yet, definitely check that one out as well. And this is just a quote from that essay where she says, "When we practice reciprocity, We spend our lives in service of community, and we trust that our community's acts of service will lift us up as well. We become accountable to one another, interdependent. We need to be part of the pod. We need to be the collective that nourishes and protects all its constituent parts according to their needs. The planet needs us to be connected. The ocean needs us to be connected. The orcas need us to be connected. And I think that summarizes so beautifully both the interconnectedness that makes the orcas who they are, and also what we can learn from them. You know, over the last year or year and a half, we've had this, you know, really coming to a head, I think in this country especially, sort of the tension between the individual and the rights of the individual, and putting your own personal needs first versus the collective, and the health of the community, and the safety of the community, and how do you look out for one another. And I think, you know, one thing that we've really learned is that we need to go back and focus on connection, that being disconnected and being all about ourselves as individuals is not faring us very well in the world. And so there are definite lessons there to be learned from the orcas. I got a little more philosophical than I was anticipating. But that's sort of the premise for this talk, is the strength of those connections and what can we learn from them. And orcas, you know, no matter where you find them throughout the world, the matriline is really central to who they are and how they operate. They're matrilineal, meaning that offspring stay with their mother. And among big killer whales, the mammal-eating killer whales that also inhabit the West Coast and the Salish Sea here, that's true as well. And you can see here a family tree for one of our best known transient or big killer whales, T46, a female that has been in the area for many decades, and her huge extended family tree of all these whales that have descended from her. And it's a matrilineal relationship that's charted here. But they don't all travel together. As the pod gets larger, they split off into these subgroups, and just highlighted in different colors here are kind of how this single matriline has split up into sort of sub-matrilines. So we still have T46 as kind of the grandmother, great-grandmother, and some of her offspring still travel with her. One of her older daughters has split off and travels with her own offspring. And now her family group has gotten large enough that one of the granddaughters of T46 has also split off, kind of forming her own little sub-matriline. Again, another older daughter split off with her offspring. Big killer whales do all kinds of interesting things when it comes to sort of fission and fusion in their societies. So there's some individuals that split off, like T46C2, and some family groups that are related, like the T123s, but don't even necessarily spend a lot of time with the original family group anymore. And this all has to do with the lifestyle that big killer whales live. They are, of course, focusing on marine mammal prey. And to do that and to hunt effectively, they need to be in small groups. They need to be able to be stealthy. And if the group size gets too large, they make too much noise in their environment, they won't be successful at hunting. So matrilines are still part of the big killer whale life history and how they socialize and how they operate. But because of the lifestyle that they live, they tend to be in these smaller family groups of 2 to 7 whales. But the real difference with the southern residents and what really makes them unique is that there is not that natal dispersal from the home group. So you don't have elder females that are starting to have their own offspring split off. You don't have individuals split off. And that entire family group stays together. So not all these whales demonstrated here in the L4 matriline are still alive, but the ones that are living are still traveling together, and this family unit travels together. They don't split into smaller groups. And again, that really comes back to how southern residents make their living. They're fish eaters. And as they're following what were historically really abundant salmon runs, they can be in these very large gregarious groups. They can be very vocal, very active at the surface. And they're, traditionally there's enough food to go around. They can, as they're in these groups, they don't their salmonid prey doesn't respond to their vocalizations and disperse or anything, they can afford to be in these large family groups and sustain themselves. And just like with the big killer whales, you know, that the prey is sort of central to everything about them. Their whole culture, their whole society is built around what they eat. And that's how their family groups form, is around what they eat. So, you know, another common question people ask is, why don't the southern residents just switch their prey? Why don't they switch to eating marine mammals? Because we have so many seals and porpoises here right now. And, you know, the answer that I come back to a lot is that's like asking them to give up who they are. That's asking them to give up their family, their home, and everything about who they are and who they've become. And I think that's an unreasonable ask, right? You know, for thousands of years, their culture and their life history has evolved around this certain prey source, and they've built these family bonds that go back for so many generations. And it's unreasonable, I think, to ask them to change that just because their environment has changed so rapidly. So when we're talking about these southern resident family groups and matrilines especially, obviously the mother-daughter bonds are kind of the glue that holds the whole society together. And we have such a unique situation here with the southern residents in particular, where we have the same individuals in this relatively small population returning to the same area year after year. And because they can be photo identified, and because of all the researchers that have done decades of amazing work, we know the histories of these whales. And, you know, I think the societies among all cetacean species are probably incredibly interesting. I don't think anyone quite matches the southern residents in terms of the family structure and the family bonds, but I think cetacean societies are just inherently interesting. But we have the opportunity with the southern residents to know them on a level that's very, very rare with a wild population, where, you know, we don't just do a census to approximate the population size. We can actually count every individual, and we know the history of those individuals in those family groups. And that allows us this incredible opportunity to watch these whales grow up over time. If you've heard me talk before, you've read my book, you know that J41 Eclipse is one of my personal favorites. And it's because I got the opportunity to see her when she was just a couple of days old there in 2005. And, you know, over the last 15 years, watch her grow up, now begin to have offspring of her own, and really see not only her grow and change, but her family unit grow and change over time. And I just wanted to highlight, you know, what a unique opportunity it is that we have with the southern residents, that, you know, whether it's a personal perspective where you're connecting with these animals on an individual level, or as a scientist studying them to this level of detail, it's a very unique situation here. And one of the things that we see among these whales, and especially among mothers and their offspring in particular, is this incredible synchrony in behavior. And that's it's exemplified by two of my favorite photos here of J14 Samish and her daughter J40 Suttles, where the left picture there is when Suttles was just a couple of years old, and they did this breach off of lime kiln here on San Juan Island in perfect synchrony. I've seen double breaches before, but never seen anything quite like that, where it was just so perfectly matched in body position and everything. And then the picture on the right, you might not even be able to tell at first that there's actually two whales there. Samish is in the back and her daughter Suttles is in the foreground. You can see it up at the front of the whales a little clearer, that there's two heads, but they're surfacing in such perfect synchrony that the dorsal fins are identically outlined with one another. They're just right next to each other and breathing at exactly the same moment. And that synchrony is something that we see a lot of among killer whales and among the southern residents in particular, especially in their breathing, where they're really matching their breathing to one another. And not only when they're right next to each other, like a mother and offspring, but even when they're spread out. Sometimes whales can be several hundred yards apart, and after a long dive, they'll still surface in perfect synchrony. And even while having a hydrophone in the water, they're not vocalizing at times. It's not like they could be coordinating that vocally, but they still somehow are so cued into what their family members are doing and what the timing is of their behaviors, that they will come up for a breath at the exact same moment. And it's sort of one of those still one of those great mysteries about why they do that. There are some theories, and there are there in practice there's some evidence of synchrony, for instance, being really useful when you're hunting. A classic example among orcas is the Antarctic killer whales, when they're rushing an ice floe to wash a seal off of an iceberg. They need excellent synchrony, executing that behavior. And so that makes a lot of sense about why they have that kind of that level of synchrony. But it's a lot less clear when it comes to breathing in unison while you're traveling. And I think it just comes back to the strength of those bonds and maintaining those bonds and that sense of connection with the other members of your family group, that, we're here together, we're doing this together. And, from a human perspective, I just kind of imagine doing a meditation or yoga where you're synchronizing your breathing with somebody else, and sort of the sense of calm and the sense of connection that can come from that. And I think, we see that very strongly among mothers and their offspring, among the Southern residents. So in addition to the mother-daughter bonds, which make up matrilines across killer whale populations, is the mother-son bond, which is really one of the unique hallmarks of resident killer whales, because it's not just the females that don't disperse, it's the males that don't disperse. And that's very unusual because, of course, the first biological reason that comes to mind of why offspring will disperse is potentially to find mates and to mate with individuals outside of your relatives. And so what do you gain by staying, with your mother's family group? And biologically, there's an explanation for that, where we know that among the Southern residents, for instance, if an adult male reaches a certain age and becomes, an older male in the community, that they have the potential to father a lot of offspring. You may be familiar with the study of paternity, the genetic study of the Southern residents, showing that J1 Ruffles and L41 Mega fathered a whole lot of offspring. The two oldest males in the population were responsible for more than half the births over, an extended time period. And so as from a genetic perspective, a biological perspective, it makes a lot of sense to support an adult male becoming an older, successful adult male to spread his genes, because females have, pretty limited reproductive potential, and that they give birth, maybe once every 5 years if they're healthy and things are going as they should. And that leads them to give birth to maybe 4 to 6 offspring over the course of their lifetime, which is a significant, genetic investment in the future of the population. But a male can potentially father many more offspring than that in the course of a lifetime. So genetically, it makes sense for a female to invest in her adult sons and support them. And help them become, successful adults, so they become successful breeding members of the population. But what we've really seen is the degree to which males are dependent on their mothers is quite amazing. Emma Foster published a paper in 2012 showing that the mortality risk for males in particular really increases dramatically after the loss of their mother. And a quote from that paper is that resident killer whales are unusual in that their mothers maintain strong social relations with their adult sons throughout their lives. Mothers may increase the survival of their adult sons in a number of ways, including assisting in foraging and providing support during agonistic encounters. And that's a role that the mother plays among killer whale matrilines, is that food provisioning. We know that these animals prey share. When a whale catches a fish, they don't necessarily eat the entire thing themselves. The members of the family group will converge and they'll share that fish. And especially, when salmon were much larger, they were much bigger, they would tear them into pieces, and there was a lot of fish to go around to all the whales in the immediate family group. And we know that adult females in particular are especially likely to share prey with their offspring, and not only the younger whales in the group, but the adult males as well. So they may be dependent on their mother as a significant source of food. And regarding the agonistic encounters, that's another hallmark of killer whale society is, you know, the physical aggression and the territoriality and those kind of behaviors is not something that we see a lot of physical evidence of. You know, they're living in these family groups 24 hours a day, 365 days a year, and somehow they're negotiating conflicts that must inevitably arise. And they do so without this physical aggression or fighting or anything like that. And they've somehow, you know, negotiated territories and habitat use and mate selection as well. It's possible that you know, those females being kind of the glue that holds the society together are really necessary for those adult males to negotiate, you know, the politics of killer whale society. It's, you know, some people theorize that mothers will introduce their son to potential mates and keep them kind of incorporated in the family group, help keep them part of prey sharing and things like that. And so when a male, especially an adult male, loses a mother, you know, the mortality rate can be something like 14 times higher for that male compared to a male who still has his mother. So it's extremely significant. And among the southern residents, just a few of the iconic mother-son pairs are highlighted here, but it's something that we see a lot of, where we see an adult male swimming next to his mother. And the initial assumption, you know, before we knew what we do know about killer whale society, is that these were alpha males with their harem of females or something like that. But in reality, more often than not, it's an adult male swimming next to his mother, and that bond is so key to the southern residents. So what happens when you lose your mother? You know, for adult males, that mortality rate goes up, but it is not 100%. And we have some interesting stories among the southern residents about whales who have overcome those odds and found ways to survive. And the J11s are one example of that, where J11 Blossom was a relatively young adult female to go missing and die in 2008. And she had 3 offspring, 2 sons and a daughter. And you know, J27 Blackberry is one of those older young adult males, was, you know, potentially in that high risk category for dying as well in the year following his mother's death. But he's found a way to persevere and survive. And another, you know, a whale of maybe even greater concern, at least to me at the time it was J39 Mako, who was only 5 years old when their mother Blossom passed away. And it's been really interesting to see the bond that these 2 brothers have formed with one another as a result. After a female passes away, we can see some interesting things. There are some families where the siblings will stay together as a unit, and there are other families where they don't. And the J11s, it's been a little bit of both, where the 2 brothers have formed this incredible bond. You know, you can see Blackberry and Mako on the left in 2009. So that was less than a year after their mother went missing. And then the same 2 whales, the 2 brothers there on the right in 2018, still forming a strong pair and still both surviving and thriving. But it's relatively uncommon to see their sister traveling with them. When Blossom was alive, we would see the whole family unit of 4 whales together. As whales are traveling through their environment, we often see a mother flanked by all of her offspring. And that collective, you know, that bond of traveling right in sort of flanking formation with one another is often broken when the mother passes away. And while we see Blackberry and Mako together, J31 Suchi has kind of taken a different path, and she's split from her matriline a little bit. And her story is a very interesting one. She's been very enamored with young whales, with calves and the calves of other whales from a young age. And so when the J11 matriline kind of split, she started associating more with the other females her age in J-pod, and especially those with young offspring. And, you know, we were all anxiously awaiting when she would give birth to her own first calf. And it's a tragic story to look at her history, you know, because of some of the fecal sampling and the amazing work that goes on with the Center for Conservation Biology and the Conservation Canine team. They can detect pregnancy through hormones from fecal samples. And we know that Suchi had to go through 7 attempted pregnancies before she had her first successful birth, a J56. So her pregnancy of J56 was detected there in 2018, and she gave birth to her in 2019. And comparing that again to the big killer whale population, where of a whale of very similar age, Suchi was born in 1995, and T37A born in 1994. And by 2019, T37A already had 5 offspring of her own, whereas Suchi had had 6 failed pregnancies and then 1 offspring of her own. And it's, you know, especially, you know, for a whale that loved calves loves calves as much as her, it was a tough story to watch unfold. And thinking about the family ties that these whales have and their huge capacity for emotion, you know, we know that that section of their brain is capable of emotional intelligence, and that's related to these strong family bonds that they have, and the grief that must entail for her to have gone through that is difficult to imagine. But you know, the perseverance aspect is another real lesson that we can take from Southern Residents, where she went through so much loss, but still now has, you know, a healthy offspring and is completely enamored with J56, as well as the other young calves that have now joined J-pod as well. But it's, again, an interesting juxtaposition between the two populations that we have here. And, you know, just briefly, I'll say that it really points to the importance of that prey resource for those two populations, that the big killer whales having so much food to eat in the way of pinnipeds and porpoises are fit enough and robust enough to give birth, in some cases every 2 years, which is really remarkable when you're talking about an 18-month gestation period. Whereas the Southern Residents are struggling to maintain that nutritional status to successfully give birth to calves. But still, you know, very, very family-oriented whales, whether it's 1 offspring or 5. So what else can happen when you lose your mother? L87 Onyx is another incredible example of a whale that has persevered and survived. So if you're not familiar with Onyx, he was born into a subgroup of L-pod known as the L12s. He was born in 1992 to L32 Olympia, and his mother passed away in 2005. And instead of staying in that L12 subgroup, which had several other elder females in the group, he made a very interesting decision, which was a strategy that had not yet been documented among these whales, in that he switched pods. And he switched to traveling with K-pod from 2006 to 2010. And he seemingly adopted some surrogate mother figures. And in particular, he went after really forming these attachments with some of the oldest whales in the Southern Resident community. Which, again, looking at the importance of these older females to the entire population, is potentially a very good way to survive. And he originally was linked up with K7 Lummi, the oldest K-pod whale. When she passed away, he linked up with K11 Georgia, the oldest then whale in K-pod. And when Georgia passed away, he made a switch again to J-pod. And again, his most common associates were J8 Spiden and then J2 Granny. And he stayed with J-pod for 10 years. And then in 2020, he switched it up again, and he went back to L-pod, but not the L12 subgroup. He went to the other portion of L-pod and is seemingly traveling with the L4s and the L4 subgroup now. And, you know, one of the amazing things and one of the fascinating things about studying killer whales is there are very few hard and fast rules where as soon as we think we know something and we say, oh, this is how they operate, this is what they do. For instance, they don't leave their natal groups, right? They stay in their mother's family group for their entire lives. Well, turns out they don't always do that. And Onyx is an example of this alternative strategy of finding kind of surrogate mother figures. They were the older females. Many of them had grand offspring, but didn't necessarily have a lot of offspring of their own. So perhaps, you know, they were available to help fulfill that food provisioning role, or that social, you know, helping build social connections or integrate you into the community and that kind of role. But whatever it is, he is incredibly savvy at you know, finding these adult females and sort of linking up with them and finding a way to survive for quite a long time, very successfully, without his mother. And so, you know, his story is continuing to unfold, and it's always, you know, where is he going to show up next? What's he going to do next? And he was the first real example of a whale, an individual, switching pods. But there was some evidence really early on in the studies of the southern residents of matrilines switching groups. And kind of a little known family group in K-pod, the K18s and the two K30s were actually originally designated as L-pod whales, because when studies began in the 1970s, they were regularly seen traveling with L-pod. And a couple of years later, they kind of switched back to K-pod. And as we began to learn more about their acoustics, we realized that they were making K-pod vocalizations. And so this family group is actually the only group of southern residents that have had their alphanumeric designations changed and had their pod reassigned. So they were originally all L-pod whales that were then redesignated with K-pod numbers, which is one reason there's some missing numbers among the L-pod matriline, because for instance, there is no L40 because she was K40 and they switched her over, and to avoid confusion, they didn't redesignate another L40. But this was some of our first evidence, I think, you know, it maybe wasn't recognized at the time, but in retrospect, that the matriline is really the central unit of killer whale society. You know, we thought for a long time maybe it was the pod, but the matrilines themselves will sometimes switch between groups, where we had, you know, these, in actuality, K-pod whales traveling with L-pod for a significant portion of time. And we've seen other groups do that since then as well. And the only remaining member of this small family group is K21 Cappuccino. And like Onyx, he has kind of found a surrogate mother, but within his own pod, he's really hooked up with K16 Opus. So again, you know, these shifting connections that happen over time between family groups and between pods. And we can't talk about southern resident family groups without talking about you know, the ultimate matriarch in J2 Granny, and what she meant to the community as a whole, as likely the oldest member of the population. You know, certainly in the later years of her life. You know, there's a lot we don't know about what she probably meant to the community, but what we do know is that when she was alive, there were a lot of these interesting scenarios where members of other pods would come and sort of have a stay with J-pod, often for the entire course of the summer, before going back to their own family group in KRL pod for the winter time. So we've had many small subgroups from Ks and Ls that would switch over and travel with J-pod. L7 and L53 did it for several years. L57, a male from L-pod, did it. The K14s switched over. K21 and his family group have spent several summers traveling with J-pod. And that's something that's kind of gone away a little bit in the passing of Granny. And I just kind of wonder, was that some sort of, summer vacation with Granny, and learning from her, and the knowledge that she had, and somehow passing that on and dispersing it to the other pods that maybe spend less time here in the Sailor Sea. Because those whales, while they traveled with J-pod, they were often primarily associated with Granny and Ruffles, the oldest male and female in J-pod. So one of those really interesting things to think about and speculate about what role did she play, not only to her immediate family, but to the entire population, and those unique bonds that formed between families for entire seasons, or sometimes several seasons at a time. And with the passing of Granny, and the passing of other females, I know I mentioned with J11s that we see some fractioning. And one thing that I've personally really noticed among J-pod is they travel in their complete matrilines a lot less than they used to. It used to be J2 and the J14s in the lead, followed by the J19s and the J16s and the J11s and 17s and 22s. And they would be in their family units, and they would pass by in these concrete family units. And they're really, sort of forming a new kind of family, I think. And it's something that humans do as well. Sometimes if you lose your family for whatever reason, that you create your own family. And I think these family oriented whales are doing that as well, as we've lost some of these key mother figures, some of these matriarchs, there's new kinds of social bonds forming. And we jokingly call what we see going on in J-pod a boy band sometimes, where all the adult and juvenile males will be traveling together in one group. And all the young sort of reproductive age females will be in another group. And they're forming these, different social units than we've seen before. This was in December 2020, where we had J and K pods traveling together down San Juan Channel. And it was a perfect example of this, where both pods were almost completely segregated into males and females. So this group included all these males: J27, J38, J39, J45, J47, J49, and then from K-pod, K26, K34, K38, and K44. So all these males, and then little J53 Kiki, a young female, was in there. She wasn't with the other females, which I thought was pretty funny. But we are often seeing the males together and the females together. So as their family dynamics change, they're potentially, creating new social bonds. And again, one of those mysteries that we don't really know what's going on, but potentially one of the impacts of losing Granny and some of the other older females in J-pod is that the social structure can change pretty dramatically. And we can't talk about families in the Southern residents either without talking about the J17s, and they're one of the family groups that we've come to know the best as we followed their story, the ups and the downs over the last 15 years or so. So J17 Princess Angeline had two daughters when I first met her in the early 2000s, and I always thought of them as this trio of whales for quite a long time. And then in 2009 and 2010, the family all of a sudden doubled in size, as all three whales gave birth to offspring over a very short time period. And by 5 years later, two of those three original females had given birth again. So all of a sudden, this was a booming family group. They were reproducing a lot. They were kind of the nursery group, often at the back of J-pod, with all these rambunctious youngsters, playing around and getting up to all kinds of shenanigans, and not necessarily traveling from point A to point B very quickly. But then tragedy really struck, and the family lost many of their members in a very short period of time, and became a lot smaller. And you may be familiar with, or certainly with, at least one of these stories, perhaps both of them, but In 2016, when J28 Polaris went missing, her young offspring J54 was struggling, and the family relationships among these whales, the aunts and uncles and brothers and sisters will try to help keep these whales alive, just like Blackberry did with his younger brother Mako. And there was just this heart-wrenching encounter that the Center for Whale Research had after the loss of Polaris, where her son J54 was just struggling. So in that picture on the left, he's very emaciated, he's very scraped up, as the other whales were trying to at times actually physically keep him afloat. And Mark Mallison, who had this encounter, wrote that at one point we observed J46 and J47 holding J54 up between them, and he appeared lifeless, laying on his side. They continued on with J54 swimming between the two of them. Within 5 to 10 minutes of us paralleling them, J35 joined in and put herself between them and us. At that point, we decided to move on and leave them be. So that was the last time that J54 was seen. And, it's one of those tragedies that comes from knowing these families so well, and from having a struggling, endangered population, is that we witness these losses and we feel them very keenly. And that was one of those moments. And then, of course, with J35 Tahlequah, 2 years later, losing her calf, carrying it for 17 days. And, I won't go into the details of what happened there, as a lot of you probably know the story, but I really found it interesting how many people connected to her and to the Southern residents through that experience. And an article from the Washington Post said that the phenomenon was no longer purely scientific interest. People wrote poems about Tahlequah and drew pictures. People lost sleep thinking about the whale. A scientist cried thinking of her. Tahlequah inspired politicians and essayists, and a sense of interspecies kinship in some mothers who had also lost children. And, at the time that this happened, the Southern residents had been endangered for 13 years. And I say a lot that she did more in that physical expression of her grief than we as humans have been able to do for the Southern residents in those first 13 years of their endangered listing, because she, through her incredible actions and the terrible grief that she went through after having already lost, her sister and, her nephew, and then her own offspring, that she really, called attention to the whales and forged a connection of so many people to the Southern residents in a way that we can't necessarily do with our own words and scientific publications and things like that, right? She somehow forged this direct connection to people between human families and whale families. And I think a lot of people got it all of a sudden about who these whales are, and why they're unique, and why they're special, and why they deserve to be protected, and why so many of us love them so much. So through that incredibly painful moment, I think she forged this very strong connection that is so crucial for the future survival of the Southern residents. And you go through any family history, whether it's human or whale, and you're going to find tragedy, and you're going to find triumph, and you're going to find births, and you're going to find deaths. And as tragic as the story was of the J17 family group for several years there, it's not all sad. And there has been a lot of hope coming out of that family group since then. And not only watching Tahlequah kind of recover from that period of grief and sort of rejoin killer whale society and become an active and playful member of JPOD again, which is something that I personally took a lot of inspiration from. But they're somewhat now, fractured matriline. It's not just the simple J17 and her extended family anymore, but they're still a unit, they're still a family. We've seen J46 Star really kind of take a little J53 Kiki under her wing. So those two have formed a bond with one another after both having lost their mothers. And then, of course, last fall, Tahlequah gave birth to a successful offspring in J57. And, you know, after the horrible ordeal that she went through with one calf, having a healthy calf, and the family group is growing again with potential in J46 and J53, you know, to be giving birth in their own right in the coming years. So the family group will grow again. And I think so many elements of this family group in particular resonate with people, and we can relate to their story and the difficulties and the, you know, the joys and everything that they've gone through, that these whales have captured the hearts of so many of us, and it has to do with those family connections. And really, we're barely scratching the surface in our understanding of these whales. You know, we've been studying them collectively for more than 40 years, and we've learned a lot, but there's still so much that we don't know. And in so many ways, we just are getting a glimpse of the interactions that go on. You know, through photo ID, we can get a sense of who's traveling with who and which whales are associating with one another. But it's just a snapshot of the complex social lives of these whales. And you know, through new technologies like photogrammetry, where there are drones flying over the whales, we get a little bit of a different look. It still only captures a piece of their lives, but we can, you know, start to look at their social relationships in a different way, and see things that we can't see from the surface about the way the whales interact. And it's super exciting to think about what some of this you know, sort of new research might reveal about these family groups and how they interact with one another. And it's really these social organizations and you know, the questions about how the whales interact and who associates with who that were really kind of you know, the spark that inspired the founding of the Orca Behavior Institute. Is, you know, we're a small group of passionate people that connect to these whales both scientifically and spiritually, I would say. And you know, there's a lot of things we can learn through data collection and tracking social networks and things like that. But there's we also spend a fair amount of time speculating about what is Onyx doing, and why is he doing that differently than other whales, and why is that working for him whereas it hasn't worked for other whales. And questions like that you know, are so much fun to discuss among ourselves. Like, how are they similar, how are they different from our human relationships? And if you enjoy that kind of thing and following the connections of which whales are traveling together and that sort of thing, I definitely encourage you, if you don't already, to follow us on social media. And if you enjoy kind of these sort of conversations of taking a deeper dive into the social structure of killer whales and the science and sometimes the non-science of it as well, I'd also encourage you to check out our Patreon page, where you can become a monthly supporter of our work. And we are just this year have started some live stream chats where we go into depth more on some of these topics and speculate about some of these things, not just internally, but with you guys as well. So definitely check us out, as these are topics that we love to talk about. And you know, you can always shoot questions our way as well. And with that, I'll try to leave a little bit of time to answer some of those questions maybe now. So thank you guys so much for having me, and let's answer a few questions here.
All right, thanks so much. So I've been going through the chat a little bit while you were talking, and I do have a few questions compiled for you. The first was Heather, and she was asking if at what age do Bigg's killer whales separate from that main matriline?
That's a good question, and there's not a concrete answer. In general, you know, I think it's often when a female is old enough that she's beginning to have her own offspring that she will split off and kind of form her own matrilineal unit. But just like I was saying, everything with orcas, there's exceptions to every rule. We have, especially in recent years, as they've been spending more time here, we've been seeing more examples of juvenile whales splitting off, maybe not permanently, but for periods of several weeks or several months, and some of them even longer than that. So I think it tends to be when the family group starts to be getting too large, you know, to be hunting as efficiently, that some of the whales will split off. But there's exceptions to every rule, and that's definitely true among the bigs as well.
Well, thanks. This one from Sam: do southern resident killer whales mate with other southern residents, or do they mate with other whales like transients?
Yeah, that is a great question. The southern residents will mate with other southern residents. We think that they preferentially will mate outside of their own immediate family group, with whales from other pods, but that's not exclusive either. There has been some, intra-pod matings as well. I think biologically they're probably capable of crossbreeding, with other populations, but they don't. The Biggs killer whales and southern resident killer whales inhabit the same geographic area, but they're completely different cultures, and part of their culture seems to be don't associate with whales that eat something different than you. And so there is no evidence that they interbreed with any sort of regularity outside of their population, which is one of the major concerns with a small population size, is if you're not outbreeding, what can that lead to? But that's some of the theories about the female relationships to their son is potentially introducing them to whales from other pods, potential future mates from other pods, and that sort of thing. But it's all within the southern resident community. They don't really associate outside of their clan.
All right, and then this question is from Ian. It says, since Granny has passed, has one of the other females changed the pod's traveling patterns, where it seems they're intercepting more offshore Chinook runs, moving south first, and then later coming into the Salish Sea for Puget Sound and Fraser salmon?
Great question. So the first piece of that is who's kind of filled Granny's role within JPod is, it wasn't clear at the beginning, but it seems like now it's J19 Shachi, based on the fact that she's often in the lead. So when the pod is, for instance, traveling up Harrow Strait, she's often the one that's out in front, the way that Granny used to be. She doesn't seem to have quite the discipline over the pod that Granny did. When Granny would go to the Fraser River, the rest of the pod would follow. When Shachi goes to the Fraser River or tries to, sometimes she has to come back because the rest of the pod doesn't want to go. So, she's not there yet. She's much younger, but she seems to be filling that role. And JPod's patterns have changed. Whether or not it's related to the death of Granny, we can only speculate. Their patterns were changing prior to Granny's death, and that they were already spending a lot less time in the Salish Sea, especially in the spring months, likely in response to the shifting salmon availability. But that has become more pronounced in recent years, and it's a reasonable theory to think that that has something to do with Granny's death, and that she was, leading them here to their sort of traditional summer grounds out of tradition. And the community as a whole seems to be spending a lot more time in the spring and summer on the outer coast, the western end of the Strait of Juan de Fuca, and that's a place where it does make sense for them to be, for exactly the reason that you suggested, that they can intercept more salmon runs from that area, because the Fraser River runs don't seem to be doing well enough to support them in the Salish Sea on their own. So there's likely more prey availability out there. And I think it's a combination of the prey and probably of the loss of Granny as well, that things definitely change when a matriarch dies, and then as the environment changes, they have to adapt as well.
Thanks. And then a question came in from Jill. Do we know if Onyx has fathered any calves in the population?
I don't think we have any definitive evidence that he has. So don't 100% quote me on that, but I don't think he has shown up among the paternity of any living southern residents. But the last paper was a little bit ago now, and I think there might be another one forthcoming that maybe we'll have some new information on that. But it remains to be seen if his strategy translates into reproductive success in the same way that J1 and L41 had. But not that I know of, is he the father of any other southern residents yet.
And so I have a few more that just popped into the chat. One asks if you have any podcasts. I know you have videos up on your website, but maybe talk about where people can go if they're interested in more topics that you cover.
Yeah, we don't do any podcasts ourselves. We have, I have been a guest several times on the Whale Scout podcast, so you can find some conversations there. And then on the Orca Behavior Institute YouTube channel, we share some presentations like this one and some of the conversations that we've had on some recent scientific papers and things like that. But in terms of more informal discussions and stuff, that's kind of something that's been new this year and so far has been among our Patreon supporters. But we post the kind of presentation portion of that on YouTube, so you can find that on our YouTube channel.
And so one question here that's really interesting, it says, do orca vocalizations, sorry, I'm losing it in the chat. Do they change in tone as the orcas age? For example, like younger individuals having higher pitched tones?
Yeah, great question. So the way that orcas vocalize is very different than the way that we vocalize. So we have vocal cords and we're passing air through our larynx, and that gives us distinct voices. So each one of us sounds different. And then that, as our bodies grow and change, that the sound of our voice can grow and change as well. It's different in the whales in that they're manipulating air in air sacs in their nasal passages to make their vocalizations. And that gives them a level of control over the sounds that they make that we don't have. And so there is no voice to a particular whale. So you can't identify a specific whale based on the qualities of their vocalization in terms of how deep or how high frequency it is. So it's not like the calves are higher pitched and the males have deeper voices. They can create kind of that whole spectrum of sounds. I do think, while they don't have signature whistles in the way that bottlenose dolphins do, I'm sure that they are always aware of who is communicating. So they must have something within the way that they vocalize that sort of identifies who they are. But it's not as simple as a voice, and it's not as simple as a signature whistle. We haven't cracked that code yet.
Awesome. So speaking of that, and for the sake of time, I'm going to ask just one more question here. And I wanted to go over, you mentioned how in sync that the orcas seem to be with each other, even in complete lack of being able to talk with one another to coordinate that. So what is your take, or how do you think these superpods just kind of seem to materialize either, right after the death of a member or like last year with J35 having that calf in September?
Yeah, that's one of the things that's really fun to speculate about. And so I don't have any concrete answers to that, but they certainly communicate in ways that we have not figured out yet. And there's always the possibility that they are scheduling things ahead of time, that they know when somebody's due to give birth, or even when we joke sometimes that when they're traveling on the west side, sometimes they're spread out and they won't be vocalizing, and on the same surfacing, all of a sudden they switch from going north to going south with no vocalizing. And so we always joke, did they say like swim north, count to 1,000, and then everybody changed direction at that time? It's possible they're coordinating things, scheduling things somehow. But I think it's equally possible there's some aspect of their communication and their understanding and synchrony with one another that we haven't tapped into, and that maybe science isn't yet capable of tapping into. And we've seen so many times unique coming together of the different pods that we just can't explain, that where we'll have one group coming down from Turn Point down Harrow Strait and another group coming in the Strait of Juan de Fuca past Victoria, and they have the physical barrier of Vancouver Island between them. So they are not within direct acoustic range of one another. But all of a sudden, because there are observers in both places, both groups start porpoising at the same time towards each other, and they all meet up. And they clearly know that they're going to meet up with, whoever's coming in or whoever's already here. And how do they do that? We have no idea. And similarly with those gatherings, the superpods, whether it's whether it's a greeting ceremony or potentially a parting ceremony. And yeah, it's one of the great mysteries. And I think it's why they're so fascinating and why they remain so fascinating, is that despite 45 years of research, we don't know. There's so much we don't know.
That's awesome. I like to speculate like a pack mind or possible whale telepathy or something. We just, like you said, we'll probably never know. But I do want to definitely thank you tonight for your time. We did have some more questions in the chat. It seems like we had some newer folks to the Southern Residents. And so I just wanted to let everybody know Monika is going to be with us on Sunday for the kickoff event, as well as a lot of other researchers. We're actually focusing on paternity quite a bit too. We're going to have Mike Ford, and then Ken Balcom at the Center for Whale Research that's been documenting the Southern Residents since the very beginning in 1976. So some of the ID questions that you all asked on how to tell them apart and a little bit more about the history is going to be something that we cover at the event. We really appreciated you kind of laying this We Are Family foundation. I think it was really important to bring this topic up in front of everybody prior to learning a little bit of the science, because it's like you said, sometimes there's just things we can't quantify or study or understand. And, even though science kind of holds you back from, personalizing or anthropomorphizing these animals, sometimes you look at something like, J35 carrying her calf for 17 days and can't really think about that in terms of anything other than grief. So there's a lot of connecting going on between humans and orcas, and everybody in the chat has been saying thank you so much. I think everybody really likes to listen to you talk and kind of recount your stories. You've got so many of them. There was somebody in there that was letting you all know in the chat too that you can pick up Monika's book on Amazon or your local bookstore. There's so much more in here that she couldn't cover in an hour, as well as, like I said, it's kind of like my go-to Bible when I need to verify or fact check my Southern Resident Orca facts in 101. So thanks so much for being here, Monika. We really hope you guys can join us for the kickoff. You can either go to orcamonth.com to look for that link, or Cindy has posted it in the chat for you all as well. But we just want to be respectful of everybody's time. So I'm going to let everybody free. Thanks for joining us this evening. And thanks again, Monika.
Yeah, thanks for having me.
Definitely.